When a serial killer is captured, there's an elite band of experts called upon by the police to help interview the deadliest category of murderer. Psychologists, psychiatrists, and profilers, they are men and women who have spent their entire working lives face to face with some of the most dangerous killers the world has ever known.
Too many similarities for the question not to be asked, and for you not to say why.
No comment.
No comment.
They paint the image that I was this monster who picked up like these altar boys along the street and swatted them like flies. I said, this is ludicrous.
I am sorry for all the pain that my actions have caused. I am prepared to die if you say it is necessary.
After working for decades intimately with the most violent people alive, our experts have developed the skills to protect themselves.
If you don't distance yourself, it will get to you over time.
I do not want some of the stuff going through their minds to be running around inside mine.
Every time that you are called upon to do it, you have to take a deep breath and you have to go back into that darkness.
Now, for the first time, these experts have come together to see if there are any common factors in the lives of serial killers that have pushed seemingly ordinary men and women to commit this most heinous of crimes.
I don't believe anyone is born a serial killer.
We need to know the motivation and what they're getting out of it.
What's feeding their fetishes?
Lack of love, lack of family bonding, lack of affection, punishment.
Could these combined factors reach a breaking point that could push the individual over the edge and help us understand what it takes to make a monster?
Serial killing is the malign waste product of a dysfunctional culture.
In the dark Victorian-era basement of Wakefield Prison in the north of England, there is a solitary cell that only those with maximum security clearance can access. Described as a prison within a prison, the cell is a reinforced glass box. Its sole occupant is afforded no privacy. He is considered so dangerous that he must be monitored 24 hours a day. This now frail 66-year-old man is a serial killer who took 4 lives in the most brutal and shocking way. His name is Robert Maudsley.
I at least spend 23 hours every day in here, and I've done so for almost 4 years. It's true to say my whole world revolves around the actual cell itself.
For 20 years following his imprisonment for murder, Robert Maudsley was allowed no contact with the general prison population. Labelled Britain's most dangerous prisoner, he spent 23 out of every 24 hours in solitary confinement, allowed out for only a single hour's exercise under the supervision of 6 prison warders. But in the mid-90s, all that changed. On a visit to Wakefield Prison, psychiatrist Dr. Bob Johnson noticed the mysterious prisoner held in solitary confinement and referred to only by a number. It wasn't long before Johnson discovered Maudsley's true identity. From there on in, he was convinced it was his duty as a doctor to see if he could discover why Maudsley had become a serial killer. Over 20 years later, he now tells the story of their extraordinary encounter for the first time.
As we're going around the prison hospital, they opened one of the cell doors and there was a wire mesh still remaining there. And behind the wire mesh was this sort of Moses figure, long, straggly beard, gaunt face. That's Maudsley. So I made a little mental note. I thought, I'm going to get alongside this man. So I'd been there possibly 2.5 years before I actually got to sit in his cell with him. The setup that I eventually arrived at was that he would sit at the far end of the bed. I would sit at the near end of the bed near the door. What I'm particularly proud of, and this took 18 months, 2 years to say, was, if you frighten me, I can't help you. Now, if you think about that, that's quite a confident thing to say. I had to assume that I had something of value to him, which he would lose if I couldn't help him, that I could possibly help him. And I sat next to the door, and one time he said, my hands are getting sweaty, my palms. I thought, I'm going out the door, you know. And that calmed him down.
Asking Maudsley about his earliest childhood memories.
I was brought up in Liverpool, and I spent approximately 16 years in various orphanages from the age of 6 months.
In this audio recording, Maudsley is recalling his childhood in Liverpool. He was born on the 26th of June 1953 to a working-class family. But at just 6 months old, both he and his siblings were taken into care after they were found to be suffering from parental neglect. Robert and his siblings spent their infancy in Nazareth House, a Roman Catholic orphanage run by nuns. The children thrived there, but 9 years after their arrival, his parents took them back. Forensic psychologist Dr. Julian Boone believes the removal of Maudsley from the safe haven of Nazareth House and being forcibly returned to his abusive parents had a devastating effect on him.
He personally blames a lot of his criminal activity, which extended to murdering 4 men, to anger against his parents. And he said that if he could have killed them in 1970, then none of these other murders would have happened. His father was a brutal man, and the children were taken away from the family and put into Nazareth Children's Home run by nuns, and they liked it very much because there was order, there was no danger and all of that.
They came to somewhere that in a lot of cases provided them for the first time with love in a very broad sense, care and support. And in Maudsley's case, you say education. You know, he was a very bright man, and you know, if we don't educate bright people, they find other ways of displacing that intelligence into other things.
As I understood it at that time, the nuns were my family and the other children. And here's a man and woman who call themselves my mother and father come and want me to take me away, you know, and I never really knew them. Well, I resented that, but I was forced, and I went back home.
Once returned to the family home in Toxteth, it was Robert who took the brunt of the beatings as he tried to defend his siblings from his violent father, who also kept him in captivity.
All I can remember of it is beatings and being locked in a room. I was locked in a room for approximately 6 months, and depending how my father felt, he would beat me perhaps once, twice a day. And I can always still remember now the key being turned into lock. When he came in, he'd have a poker or a piece of wood in his hand, or even a rifle. And I can remember he busted a rifle on my back. It was a .22 air rifle. And when he'd beaten me, he'd close the door, I'd hear the key turn, and he'd walk away laughing.
We're talking extreme here, in that he was shut in his room for 6 months on one occasion, and only interrupted by his brutal father coming in and hitting him repeatedly, and on one occasion breaking a gun on the back of his back.
I think something that stands out with Robert Maudsley is the extreme nature of his early environment and how abuse and being treated in a very negative manner that didn't allow any normal development.
Dr. Adrian Needs was a former prison psychologist at Wakefield Prison, where Maudsley is now kept.
I think the level of neglect would have, well, might sound rather obvious, but it would have not allowed any scope for normal social development, a normal sense of being able to feel valued, regulate his own feelings, behave towards other people. Also, it wouldn't have really given him much of a foothold on being able to understand other people's perspectives in an ordinary sort of way. Instead, what it would have given him was a very thorough training in distrusting others, a sense that the world is a dangerous, very unforgiving sort of place, and really it would have emphasised the fact that he was very much on his own in this world.
In 1970, as soon as he reached his mid-teens, Maudsley fled the family home and his abusive father and headed to London. But despite the lure of the bright lights of the city, he would soon find himself enveloped by the darkness of life, living on the streets.
Once there, picked up what's been described as a massive drug habit, which he managed to pay for by rent boy activities.
I think runaways often do experience, at least initially, a degree of freedom and escape from a very negative home environment. And I suppose, for a while at least, it seems that life opens up other possibilities for them. Maybe there are dreams of success or being accepted, or that kind of thing. It's just unfortunate that with lack of resources, opportunity all too often, and the fact that there are other people all too willing to take advantage, they do end up being abused and end up being enmeshed in the world of drugs and so forth. And the more they become enmeshed, the more difficult it is for them to break out.
One of the recurring comments that I hear from family, from social workers, from the police, is that this person was taking the drugs to try and escape either the sheer physical awfulness of their life or the psychological awfulness of their life. The trouble is they merge together. The drugs create psychological awfulness, and people continue to take them to escape from that situation they found themselves in.
To feed his drug addiction, Maudsley offered sexual services, picking up men in clubs and pubs around the West End. It was at one of these clubs that he would meet his first victim, a man by the name of John Farrell. Farrell's actions would be the trigger that would set Maudsley on the path to becoming a serial killer.
He was working as a rent boy. He was heavily into drugs and so forth. Apparently his client, on one occasion, showed him some photos of children that he'd abused. I guess why would somebody do that? Well, possibly there was an element of gloating about it, almost pride that the person had inflicted this suffering on children. And that must have had a very strong resonance with Robert. And it seems that at that point he just lost it.
Having lured Farrell into a public toilet, Maudsley fashioned a garrote from a necktie and strangled him to death. The sight of his agonized victim and the pleasure it gave him would forever be etched in Maudsley's mind.
It is a very personal crime, strangulation. I'm certainly aware that people do gain some excitement from watching the face of the individual, from being that close. You've got to be that close. The person can touch you, the person can attack you. You can touch them, you can see their breathing, you can see the colour changes in their face. It is a very personal way of killing.
Maudsley made little effort to disguise or deny his crime and was picked up by police at the scene. The attending officers nicknamed the killer Blue because of the colour of his dead victim's face. Maudsley's first murder represented a turning point. He believed he'd done the world a favour by ridding it of a child abuser, and saw himself, like so many other serial killers, as now having a purpose in life.
People who do bad things sometimes believe they're doing it for the best of motives, and often with anger, even displaced anger, there can be a sense of moral righteousness, a sense that the victim has done something wrong or the victim's a bad person, and that somehow justifies them perpetrating assault, torture, and eventually death.
Maudsley has always refused to discuss any details of the actual murders themselves. But Dr. Bob Johnson was convinced that the first murder Maudsley committed was a direct reaction to the abuse he had suffered as a child, and it was no coincidence that his first victim was a child abuser.
Universally, all the murderers I talked to had an appalling childhood, and the link between the appalling childhood and the murder is absolutely 100%. And my task was to break the link, because the trouble with trauma and human beings is the child is traumatized, the child shuts the trauma away in a box, and it stays, and it leaks, but the box is never examined. And the box isn't examined because the child has learned, lift the lid on the box, and you're dead. It's not cups of tea, it's dead. So I have to say, actually, the box is empty. As he talks about it, as he thinks about it, it happens again. If he'd said to me, I'm shut up in this wardrobe, in his mind he's back in the wardrobe. My father took out his belt at me and beat me. His father's doing it now. If you're not careful, he projects the picture of his father onto you. So you become the father who's about to beat him, so he kills you to stop you beating him. That's the deal. When he's killing people, he's thinking of his parents.
For the murder of John Farrell, Maudsley was given an indeterminate life sentence, and in the spring of 1974 was sent to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital. Whilst he was no longer a danger to the public, the same could not be said for the prison population he encountered.
When Maudsley was given an indeterminate life sentence, it liberated him. In that sense, it made him exceptionally dangerous because he had nothing to lose. And because he was in an environment where he was surrounded day by day with the very people that he was the biggest threat to.
He's in prison. He's going to stay in prison. What more can the justice system do to him? You know, normally the breaks on homicide are, oh, maybe I'll get sent to prison, maybe I'll be caught, maybe there'll be punishment to follow. For him, he's in prison. Why should he be restrained by that anymore? But not only that, in prison are paedophiles, the group who he hates most of all.
Maudsley's first 3 years in Broadmoor passed without incident. Despite refusing to socialize with child molesters, there was never any suggestion of violence. But in February 1977, all that changed. Maudsley and fellow prisoner David Cheeseman entered the cell of a convicted paedophile, David Francis. Once inside, they barricaded the door. A brutal and sustained 9-hour attack unfolded. Francis was mercilessly beaten and tortured by Maudsley and Cheeseman. By the time the prison guards forced their way into the cell, Francis had given up his struggle and was found dead on the floor.
Actually, the prison uniquely gave him a safe environment to commit this murder in the way that he wanted to, in the way he wanted to, which is quite strange.
Dr. Richard Shepherd is one of the world's leading pathologists and an expert on the terminal nature of injuries caused by torture.
The features of torture are many and complex. I mean, at one end you could have simple evidence of binding, of ropes being used, being tied around sensitive areas of the body. You could have cigarette burns. But the key feature is the multiplicity of non-lethal but painful injuries. So cigarette burns, burns with chemicals, small prodding injuries to the skin with a sharp weapon, superficial cutting injuries to the skin, damage to the mouth, the lips, very sensitive areas, damage to the genitalia, very sensitive areas.
There was some suggestion that things might have started off fairly low-key, but escalated over the course of the 9 hours, with the violence getting more and more extreme until eventually you moved from torture to, I believe, breaking a plastic spoon and sticking it through the victim's ear to the brain, which gave rise to the untrue reports of cannibalism.
What that did by putting the spoon into his ear, right here, it went right in, so there was loads of blood, as you may imagine, and also made sort of headlines, because until then Maudsley had not been particularly noted by the press. But because he was doing this, he became known as Hannibal the Cannibal. Once he'd killed him, he's supposed to have picked up the body and held it aloft, trophy style, to the people who are trying to talk to him.
Having committed his second murder of a paedophile, this time in prison, Maudsley became even more convinced that his crime was justified and he was ridding the world of a pestilence. This, in turn, convinced the authorities that the crime was premeditated and that he must be removed from Broadmoor to a maximum security prison. Maudsley was moved to Wakefield in the north of Yorkshire, but any hopes that his violent urges would be contained were gravely misguided.
I worked at Wakefield Prison not many years after, and it was a Victorian maximum security prison. Facilities were limited. I mean, they still had slopping out. You didn't have your own toilet in your cell, basically. He was probably surrounded with people that had committed the sorts of crimes that might have reminded him of the abuse that he'd suffered.
With a large number of sex offenders amongst the general prison population, it wasn't long before Maudsley had identified new targets. After several months in the prison, Maudsley was ready to kill again, and in July 1978, he was about to join the rarefied ranks of the serial killer. But did his plan have an ulterior motive?
Maybe he thought that if he did this, committed the murders, then he would be sent back to the secure hospital.
Just as he had resented being removed from Nazareth House as a child, so Maudsley resented being moved from Broadmoor, where he'd enjoyed significantly greater freedoms than he was permitted at Wakefield. Maudsley's ambition became to kill 7 paedophiles in a single day. However, his first victim was Stanley Darwood, a wife killer. Maudsley stalked him before following him into his cell, where he knifed him with brutal efficiency and left him to bleed out on the cell floor.
Robert Maudsley felt a kind of perverse justification in what he was doing. It's not uncommon that you say, I'm ridding the world of prostitutes, they're a blight on civilized society. I'm ridding the world, in his instance, of child abusers. There's substantive, in his mind there would have been substantive mitigation for what he was doing. He might have even thought perversely that it was an understandable act. These people were in prison, they were horrible people, they were child abusers. Look what I've done. It's a good thing in many ways. But the central tenet of Maudsley's psychology, I think, was less to do with that and more to do with the fact that given a life sentence that he would never escape from, that he would never be released, he was given a license to kill.
I think he did on the day in question make 2 paper coffins and put human hair in them, which seems to have almost a ritual significance to it. So maybe this was part of him psyching himself up to do what he did.
The death of Darwood failed to satisfy Maudsley's bloodlust, and within minutes he'd moved on to his 4th and final victim, paedophile William Roberts, whom he killed with equal brutality and force.
With the utmost calmness, Maudsley then walked to the prison officers' area and said, "Well, it's going to be 2 less for dinner this evening."
Having taken 4 lives, Maudsley was now officially a serial killer. But because the crimes had taken place in prison, they attracted very little media publicity. But in 1982, all that changed when a news crew visited Wakefield. They were filming an item about prisoners in solitary confinement, which is where Maudsley was now being contained after the double murder. A few clips of this interview survive, and Dr. Richard Badcock, one of the UK's leading psychiatrists who has interviewed over 30 serial killers, believes it offers clues as to Maudsley's mental and physical state that may have led him to commit these murders.
There is evidence of mental deterioration. My speech has been affected. There is also a past welfare officer, a Mr. Alan Murray, who has on several occasions written letters saying that he is deeply concerned in respect of my speech, which has only been affected since my detention in solitary confinement.
Well, the immediate thing you notice is that Robert has an involuntary tic, which could be psychological.
My speech has been affected. Mr. Hogan, a good friend of mine, finds it difficult to comprehend what I say.
Although if he's got a history of minor head injury associated with abuse, you'd also be concerned to make sure he doesn't have a minor degree of brain damage. If Robert doesn't have a degree of head injury, and I've not read anything which suggests he has, then the tics would be his mind's way of venting some of the tension within without him having to put it into words. The problem with it is that it leaves him emotionally over-controlled. And the problem with emotional over-control is that you can cope with sometimes quite large elements of stress and tension without showing any response. But once you've reached your limit, then instead of overreacting in a proportionate way, people tend to react excessively, to explode. And in Robert's case, unfortunately, that's involved murder.
The broadcast of the interview led to a national outrage and saw Maudsley dubbed Britain's most dangerous prisoner. It left the authorities with a dilemma about how to deal with him.
Maudsley, to the authorities, has become a loose cannon, an explosion that they cannot disarm. They then have to do something drastic, and their solution in 1983 is to build, specially for him, a maximum security special unit within a maximum security prison in the bowels of Wakefield Prison. I have been there many times, where he will be constantly observed. And I experienced this myself when I was obliged, as head of psychology at Wakefield Prison, to go and interview him. And at the time, you could feel the tension in the room. And Maudsley was a gaunt, emaciated, sunken-faced figure with long, straggly hair, who didn't look at the other people, who did what he had to do and then withdrew back into his cell.
One of emptiness, lack of hope. Every day is the next day. I don't appear to have nothing to look forward to. I've always got a sense that no officer takes any interest, and I resent that, because they only seem to be concerned with opening the door and then making sure I get back in as soon as possible. And every time I see an officer pass, I think, well, you know, he could just stop and talk if he wanted to, but he doesn't, you know. And it's thoughts like that that I think about most of the day.
He is permanently alienated, permanently unhappy, permanently feels distant from other people, regardless of their attempts to make contact with him. I think that kind of discontent, that quality of discontent, is something which clinically I associate with, in particular, the emotion of envy or jealousy. Nothing that you've got is ever going to be as good as what other people have got. People will make efforts for others, but they don't make efforts for you. And then that further makes it that much harder for him to get into contact with his own emotions. It's really a state of quiet despair.
I see this as part of going back to my childhood and to the room I was actually detained in for 6 months. And it constantly brings back memories of that, and that torments me.
In Robert's case, there is reason to think that he hoped that his abuse at his parents' hands would spare his siblings similar treatment. So lying at the bottom of everything is possibly Robert's attempt to do things for other people. And one of the difficulties he's got in prison is that there are lots of people doing things to him, but he's not in a position to be able to do very much, if anything, for somebody else. And yet that is such an important part of ordinary human life.
The sense of despair and hopelessness experienced by Maudsley finds its expression in the most brutal of violence. It was primed in his most formative years.
Maudsley was a time bomb that was built when he was a child, and it was almost inevitable, I think it was inevitable, that he would explode, because what he experienced when he was abused and raped caused him to identify with the victim, and that was enforced in his subsequent life as a rent boy, when he was subjugated, when he was sold. The only thing he had to offer was his body, and he had to sell that. So that perpetuated and deepened and ingrained this bitter, redolent, and growing hatred that he had of child abusers. There was absolutely no way that he would not have eventually, given his life choices, very limited as they were, eventually exploded in the way that he did.
20 years after the broadcast of the news item from Wakefield Prison in which he featured, Maudsley refused to speak to anyone about his life or crimes. The only person to break through this barrier was psychiatrist Dr. Bob Johnson, who over a 2-year period in the mid-90s won Maudsley's confidence and encouraged him to talk. Dr. Johnson believes their sessions 20 years ago enabled Maudsley to open up and get back in touch with emotions which he had had to subvert in order to survive his abusive childhood. This is the first time these tapes have ever been heard and give a sense of the progress Johnson made in his sessions with Robert Maudsley.
You're doing very well, you know. What do you think?
Yeah.
You are?
It's gone well.
It is, isn't it?
It's gone well.
How would you describe the progress? If I say it's how would you say? What's the progress that you're making?
The progress of today, I think you've come more into the room with me, even though at a distance.
Right.
I'm able to talk about things, a lot more things today than I was able to, say, 6 or 9 months ago.
Great. You've got more confidence.
I think I've had a good perception, Bob, in terms of where the problem areas lay.
Right.
But I like to discuss with people like yourself, Bob, the various problems that exist in order for me to actually ascertain and say, well, yeah, this man knows what he's doing, or doctor, or what. She's not going to get nothing else, or she's going to get in the future is a lot of nonsense.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. Bullshit. Yes, that's right. Yes. No, I think that's absolutely right.
He says, I'm able to talk about things a lot more. Why is that an advantage? Because he can gradually cut the link between the abuse and today. He's acknowledging that. And I say, great, you've got more confidence. And then he says, I think I've had a good session, Bob, in terms of where the problem areas lay. So in his mind, he's sorting out that's a danger area, I'm creeping up on him. It was a good session because I wanted to go there. I needed to go there, and he's gradually getting enough confidence to go there. Whereas before, it's a no-go area. Bang. Come here and you are dead.
But at the end of the day, we should come clean with our consciousness and our spirit and our souls to the extent that we can turn around and say, okay, let's be reborn again and go through all the experience we have done.
Because you cleared it through, yeah. Brilliant. No, that's very, very good.
And to be satisfied, like you were saying, Bob, like that there are no blocks, that we don't turn around and say, oh, well, that particular behaviour was particularly nasty, let's forget about that.
That's right.
I want to say to him, look, whatever happened, I'm not particularly interested in the details, just the severity of it matters. You are not a toddler today. You are not helpless. And you argue with them with that. You say, how old are you? And when you can move it a bit further along, you get them to sit the parent, the abuser, the granddad, whoever it is, in an empty chair, and you say, stop. I'm not going to let you do that anymore. It's what they wanted to be able to do when they were 6. They can't do it because the person who's doing the abuse is twice their size.
And then, just as Bob Johnson believed his therapy sessions were close to making a real breakthrough with Maudsley, they were abruptly stopped with little explanation given from above. Dr. Johnson hasn't seen Maudsley since, and so he's once again left alone with his dark thoughts, in complete isolation, for 23 hours of every day.
Well, I'll admit there have been occasions when I've wanted to commit suicide. I've attempted. The officers are not aware of that, but certainly I have attempted to commit suicide.
If you look at the words themselves, they're an expression of despair. Again, Robert talks about these things in quite an unemotional way. He says, and he's right, that if he talks about his feelings of wanting to kill himself, for example, then the risk he runs is of having more restrictions put on his movements and his actions, which is true. You couldn't say that he's comfortable with it. What you might say is that he's complaining about these things without showing the level of distress that you would expect somebody in that situation saying those things to be expressing.
One long period of depression, but that is intensified by deeper periods of depression. And I certainly have my moods, but unrelated to actual mental illness, the more related to my circumstances and conditions.
One slightly pathetic, in the true sense of the word, note is that he got so desperate not long ago that he wrote and asked, could he have a budgerigar? And then he said, fear not, I will love it, I won't eat it. And then went on to say, failing which, can I have cyanide tablets, please, to finish me off?
Maudsley's genesis as a serial killer is deeply rooted in his abusive childhood, an abuse which in effect continued into his adulthood as he sought refuge in a drug habit which he funded through prostitution. The question remains, if he had been left at Nazareth House, where he and his siblings were happy, rather than being returned to his abusive parents? And had he been helped at an early age, might he have avoided committing any acts of violence altogether?
He was astonishingly intelligent, articulate, interested in a lot of different things, widely read. You can hear he's articulate. And he's also honest. He says, I can now say things now that I couldn't say 6 months ago. Now that is the process we began. Every murderer, and I've treated 50 of them in Parkhurst Prison, every murderer killed a parent figment. Some sort of image from the past, twice their size, 5 times their size, who's going to kill them if they don't kill the person. Sadly, it's the wrong person at the wrong time. You get a flashback onto the father's face, flashback onto the person in front of you. You get confused, you misperceive, and you kill. The end point of all this approach is, right, Robert Maudsley, tell me why you killed. And I'd want him to explain, I killed parental figments. And I'd want him to talk through that in a calm way. When he can say it all, he's not going to hurt anybody again.
Since his last meeting with Maudsley in 1998, Dr. Johnson has tried to contact him on several occasions. Only once has he ever received a reply in the form of a handwritten note, which simply read, "All alone now."
I know a popular view is to say that, well, somebody who's killed like that, you should throw away the key, but I think his situation is rather different to a lot of serial killers, both in the nature of his victims, and this is not to discount the seriousness of what he's done, because the victims probably still have families and that sort of thing, but seeing things in the overall context of his life and the circumstances of his offending, I wonder whether we as a civilized society ought to be thinking about helping him a bit more in his last, what's realistically are going to be his last few years. And it does raise the question, does society owe that to him after the way society let him down when he was a child?
For nearly 40 years, he has been this way entombed. And it raises the question, in my mind at least, and I know this is a cautionary perspective, is this humane containment? It's licensed and it is legal, but when you see it and witness it firsthand and you realize that this has gone on and will continue until he dies, is this really what civilized culture should be doing, no matter how heinous and horrific the offender, no matter the risk? What are the options? Would it really be quite so terrible to consent to his request to end his own life?